Welcome to Zoe, who's going to talk about data interpretation in online exams. Over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Burke, and I'm from the University of Bath. And before I start, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me here today and giving me the opportunity to tell you about how we've been using data interpretation as creative learning experiences and also as authentic assessments in our online exams. To give you a little bit of context, I almost exclusively teach at MSc level. In 2019, we launched new programs, MSc programs in molecular biosciences. And the students who enroll on this course can choose one of 4 specialisms, these being microbiology, medical biosciences, biotechnology, and bioinformatics. And we've consistently recruited around 40 students each year. I'm also the Director of Studies for these courses, and 40 students is a very manageable number, and I consider myself to be very privileged to be working with such a small cohort because I do get to know them quite well during the year that they spend with us. And this has been quite useful in being able to convince them that some of the changes that we've adopted in terms of teaching and assessment are useful for them. Once they know you a little bit better, they're more willing to listen to you and attempt some of the things that you've put in place to help them learn. I hope she doesn't mind me saying, but Momna was the one who set up these programs. She's hiding behind the computer there. And I have to say, a lot of thought went into the planning and design of the assessments linked to the units within these programs to reduce assessment burden on the students, but also to give us assessments that allow us to test those skills that we expect our bioscience students to gain while they're with us. Okay. So traditionally in biosciences, there is a tendency for us to set essay-based questions in exams, and this is certainly true of our undergraduate courses and used to be true for our MSc courses as well. And although you can test those higher level skills of analysis and synthesis with essays, there is a tendency for students to rely very heavily on their factual recall, and they often brain dump all the information that they have. And this doesn't always answer the question that they're being asked. So we've moved towards using data interpretation. And of course, students are able to rely less on their factual recall. And we can use these data interpretations to assess their abilities to analyze and synthesize and apply their previously learned knowledge and principles. So where are we using these data interpretation activities and approaches? Predominantly on one of our 4 units called the Advances in. So for each of our 4 specialisms, we have an Advances in microbiology and Advances in biotechnology and so forth. And the students are exposed to quite a broad range of topics within that specialism. But there's a very heavy emphasis on molecular techniques and how those techniques are used in current research for that field. So we do a lot of data interpretation within this unit. Now, when we first get our students in and give them the introductory lecture to these units, we tell them about the content and the approaches that we're going to use, and then tell them that we're going to give them data interpretation in their exams. And their reaction is just panic usually. One of the students this year said they are just filled with fear at the prospect of going into an exam and seeing data they've never seen before and having to explain it, which is a little bit of a shame because they are MSc students and they're bioscientists, and this is what we expect of them. So how do we prepare our students for data interpretation in online exams? Well, each of our Advances in units starts with 3 weeks of molecular techniques. All of our students get this, and this is delivered predominantly through pre-recorded materials and then supported in person with Q&A sessions and opportunities to look at data generated by different techniques and explain what this data means and the controls that you need and so forth. The rest of the unit, which is year-long, is then delivered through a mixture of traditional lectures, which the students do sometimes say they want, guest speakers and experts in the field, but we do a lot of interactive sessions, in-class data analysis, journal clubs. We ask the students to do seminar presentations, presenting back to us data from papers. And then we end the unit with a mock exam, where they have a time-restrained attempt at a type of question that they would get in the exam. Okay. So what are these data interpretation approaches that we're using? The first is abstract writing. I think this is one of Momna's favorites. We give the students a very small data set of around 2 to 3 figures. They have a short paragraph explaining the background to the study and figure legends. And then we ask them to do 3 things. They have to write appropriate figure titles for each of the panels, then produce a 250-word abstract that incorporates the background and the aims to the study and their interpretation of the data. And they also have to produce a graphical abstract, which is a really nice creative way of solidifying their understanding of the data and some of the concepts and principles represented by that data. So this is our first example. Another approach we use is to give the students a paper, and they get this a week in advance of the exam, and then they come into the exam and they have 4 or 5 questions specifically related to the paper. And these questions, I've got some examples on the screen here, start off relatively straightforward, where we're just testing students' understanding of the aims of the research, and they gradually get more challenging, where we push the students to appraise or justify the approach the researchers have taken to answer their scientific question. And then, last but not least, the third approach we take, which I just simply call data interpretation, is my favorite. It's very similar to the abstract approach, where there is a short paragraph introducing the study. They have a lot more data in terms of figures. Here we have about 8, and they have the figure legends. But rather than writing an abstract, we ask the students to explain the data in each of the panels with reference to the purpose of each technique and the controls that are used. And this particular example here is about the role of a particular protein in keratinocytes. So we ask the students what can be deduced from the data that they've been given about the role of that protein in these cells. Now, I haven't got any fancy stats or analysis. What I have done is pulled out the high and low marks for the exams that we ran this year for each of those approaches. And what you can see is there's quite a good range for each type of approach that we've taken. And I've also pulled out some sample answers from the students this year relating to that data interpretation on the YAP protein. So this panel basically shows you that if you take patient cells, these are patients who have a mutation in a particular gene that causes a depletion in a population of cells. If you then replace that gene, so a gene therapy approach, you can rescue the phenotype. And you can see that student 1 here has correctly identified the effect of this treatment. They've used all the correct terminology. They've identified the cell types that are affected. And they even go on to explain what the implications of this are for the patient. Okay. For student 2, they have also identified the correct answer in terms of the effects of the gene therapy, but you can see that their answer is a lot more vague. It lacks some of the insight to the significance of the data. So we feel that these approaches are quite discriminating in terms of identifying really strong students and the not so strong students. And feedback from the students this year has been very positive. Some of them came to me after the exams and said they really enjoyed doing this type of question in the exam, as opposed to writing an essay. And they felt that this approach really helped to prepare them for the next step of their course, which is where they go on to do the research project 2, where they'll be generating their own data and carrying out analysis on the data that they've generated in the lab. And I think I'm just about at 10 minutes, I'm not sure. So I'll take some questions. Anybody has questions?
Timing or that? Any questions for Zoe? Yeah, sorry.
It's lovely. It's a really great example about how to go about doing this kind of really good. I need to see it.
I was going to share them with you, but then Joe told me they'd be publicly available and I have to write quite a lot of them for the exam.
We'll be rationale anyway. The question is, for the data set, does everybody get the same data set, or do you supply a number of different variations of the data set?
Okay, so for my advances in exams, in the first half of the exam, they get 3 data interpretation questions and they choose 2. So I tend to design them so they are linked either to the topics we study in advances in or their optional units, so that they have some choice around their preferences, but otherwise they all get, the same questions. Something I forgot to mention. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Something I forgot to mention related to being able to cheat in exams is what we have noticed is if we use real data sets from papers, this is much more Googleable than the last example I showed you where I mocked up all the data using published articles. So that's less Googleable.
Really helpful. Steve?
Yeah.
Do you have any impression of which of the question types the students either prefer or do better at?
I was actually really surprised how well they did with the third example, the data interpretation, because they were most intimidated by that when I spoke to them, but they actually did really well. So I think they did better in that than they did with the paper analysis.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.